What's up, everyone? Thralls Metal here once again. I'm Crockneck.
And I am Jamming John.
Said it slower that time. And we have another album review for you. This time we are reviewing a relatively new band, Xenobiotic, with their new album, Mordrake. This came out the 22nd of February on Unique Leader Records. And this is, again, a relatively new band. They're from Perth, Australia. They formed in 2011, and this is only their second full-length. They have a couple of other EPs, but other than that, very fresh. They kind of have a style that's kind of deathcore meets technical death metal meets gent, and a lot of atmospheric stuff. It's a really interesting listen. Mm-hmm. The opening track, Insomnia, does a really good job building tension with a nice dissonant melody. And instead of just exploding after a little silent moment, which is kind of a known deathcore trope, this actually builds up the rhythm section a little bit, brings in the drums and the bass, and then does eventually explode with a nice big vocal break, which, you know, that's pretty much a big deathcore trope where as soon as you hear that silence, then the singer yells something, and then a complete stranger beats the shit out of you in a pit.
Which is why we don't get in the pit.
We don't get in the pit.
Old.
But right away, the production on here and their overall sound instantly remind me of what we're jamming right now, Rivers of Nile. Definitely has a lot of atmosphere and ambience, but it balances it out pretty well with pummeling riffs, syncopated chugs.
I got reminded of Vision of Disorder's imprint. Most notably, it was in the beginning, too, where the bass and drums are playing. It was the song Jada Bloom off of Imprint. That's what I took. But
one of the things I definitely took was more along the lines of their earlier stuff was Fallujah, how they like to use a lot of tremolo, atmospheric spots, and it definitely had that over, again, pummeling riffs, which I thought was really cool, and there are some slight cleans peppered in here, too. Like, they're generally more in the background, you know, underneath the growls, which the growls are layered and all over the place as far as cadences, register.
yeah, the vocals are very diverse,
Yeah.
which is not something known to deathcore either. Usually it's just a growl or a high-pitched scream, but this guy is kind of all over the map.
Light That Burns the Sky kind of continued on. It almost had kind of a technical metalcore sound to it. Like, part of it even kind of reminded me of early BT band, like before they really went the route of prog. It kind of kept that feel for a little bit up until this out of nowhere Blackened section came out. So we get kind of Blackened deathcore, but it's almost kind of more along the lines of like Black Gaze, like Death Heaven and Alcest. And actually, it really worked here, though, because unlike those bands, it doesn't really labor that point for too long. It doesn't strum the same chord for what feels like 3 weeks. And just gets right down to the meat of it. And this is where you hear that high register scream come out from the singer, which just really opens it up.
He reminds me a lot, in this track specifically, he reminds me a lot of John Davey from Job for a Cowboy.
Yeah, just bouncing between registers, and again, the vocal cadences are really, really cool on this.
The cleans remind me of the cleans in the new Fit for an Autopsy.
Yeah, actually,
It's
it's just
like that.
kind of like this kind of processed howl that's in the background. It's not really in the forefront, because the growl is still more in the forefront. But it's interesting, it adds a different dynamic to the vocals, which I really liked. This is where some of the gent stuff kind of comes in. There's definitely some very almost bleed-like gallops on this song.
Yeah.
And there's some really interesting polyrhythms, though, that are more like technical death metal. Like, there's parts in there that reminded me of Decapitated. You know, especially
I was gonna say.
Yeah, like Organic Hallucinosis, that sort of like really wild technical drum work where it's just very rhythmic and chuggy and just machine-like.
That drum beat in Spheres of Madness.
Yes.
Yeah. Next in line was the song Inverted, which I thought was really fucking cool. It just explodes.
Yes.
From the instant it comes in, it explodes into a blast. It reminds me a lot of Aborted.
That was the first thing I thought of, too. Just the very techy riffs, but a very fast driving rhythm. It's no different than the first two tracks. Like, this is just all-out, high-speed tech death, pretty much.
The chorus has kind of like a metalcore feel to it. The vocals don't have any cleans. They don't go kind of like I like to call it puss.
Good placement on this track, though, because it keeps those first two actually standing out a little bit more, and you have this one that just breaks out and becomes this absolute monster of a track. And there were elements of tech death in here that I thought were very similar to a band like Neuraxis. You know, it just cool, complex riffing, but still very catchy. And there's like a little thrashy undertone to them. Cedia had pretty much right away an opening Meshuggah-like breakdown that I instantly, I like that. Now, this is where I started to notice a theme on this album across the board is sort of a constant ambience, whether it's a strummed tremolo or just synths in the background. And that's something that I liked and disliked, because you kind of feel like it becomes static after a certain point, at least I did. I like ambience, but sometimes when it's overused, it just becomes, like I said, it just kind of becomes like static. It's really just there.
Now, I think differently. I think if you're going for that feel on the album, you want to kind of keep it there. Because to me, it adds more fullness to even parts that weren't necessarily full. Just kind of having that drone in the background just made it almost bigger.
I would have preferred, like, that, good bass line chug, the big main riff there, and throw a cool lead melody on top of it, but not to the point where it's just drenched in that. Because that was one of the issues where I had later on the album, is that ambient noise sometimes takes the forefront and drowns out the main riff of the song, which, that's the hook, that's the anchor for me, at least. I want to just hear that.
But I think for something as experimental as this album seems like, because this album really is all over the map, as far as the influences. I mean, I wrote down bands for days that this band reminds me of, like Cattle Decapitation, Iron Dissonance. Reminded me of the band Ordnance as well. If you're not familiar with Ordnance, it's Alex Rudinger's kind of first band.
Now this leads into an interlude, and there are a couple of interludes on here, and honestly, it leads in so well, this interlude, the transition's seamless, to the point where it made me think, why is this actually a separate track? It's maybe about 2 minutes, maybe a little bit less. It just doesn't seem necessary that it's actually there. It should have been a continuation of Acedia. It adds a little bit of extra ambience and atmosphere, but ultimately I didn't think it was necessary being a separate track. That's just pretty much the main point there.
I will say that the riff in this song was heavy as balls, though.
Now, Sapphiros was a mutual favorite. Personally, I think this is the standout of the album. This is hands down the best track. I think it's constructed beautifully. I love the way it builds tension with this beautiful melody in the beginning before just erupting, but not into like just this brutal section. It's very melodic. It's very hooky.
It's got a piano in the intro.
It's gorgeous. It reminded me of like a Black Crown Initiate, but also with that kind of Death Heaven ambience behind it.
Yeah.
But this is, I think, where the ambience really worked, because they broke it up with some clean sections and some really notable melodies. And they even have a guest vocal from a clean vocalist from the band Depart. I can't remember his name, actually, but really good standout moment. This made this track really just stand out entirely in the album. Now, one of the things that I kind of brought up when we were listening to it was, when you have a guest clean vocalist, are they going to be able to do that live? And if they can, was it really necessary? But I mean, I kind of like the idea of them just wanting to hang out with their buddies.
Yeah, I mean, I've guest spotted on a couple albums now, and it's stuff that they could have done on their own accord. But I mean, if you got the opportunity to add one of your buddies into the mix, come hang out in the studio, because going to the studio is fun.
Like I said, I think this was like the strongest songwriting on the entire album. This was just dynamic as hell.
The end of this song, too, has a Catatonia feel to it.
Yeah, especially when the clean vocals come in. It's very layered electronics, which there are some electronic flourishes on this, but they're kept to a minimum. They're mostly just used as a sort of a segue to another track.
I wanted to bring up Fractured only because this would be their gent song. For sure. This just screamed Meshuggah meets Uneven Structure meets Textures, Humanity's Last Breath. It had a good lead in it as well, because leads aren't overly prevalent on this album. While it is melodic and ambient and dissonant, leads don't appear much, but there was a solid lead on that song.
Actually, I like the solo that was on Sapphiros, too. I think that was a real standout. It was just short, and that's kind of a theme with the solos when they do appear. They're very brief, but they're generally pretty tasteful. Now, this goes into another interlude, Thalamus, which this one just kind of screamed like one of the little in-between tracks on Mudvayne's LD50.
Yep.
Not super necessary. It's more of just a drum track with some weird
The end of the song, Ed Gain.
Yeah, so it's just one of those, it's kind of there, and it doesn't lead into the next track, which the next track is one of my favorites, Grieving the Loss of Self, which is an absolute monster, much like Inverted. This is more straightforward tech death than anything else.
Yeah, the beginning sounds like Ulcerate.
Reminded me a lot of Black Dahlia Murder with the vocal variety between lows and highs. It's a good, nice pick up the pace because Fractured was a little bit slower, and then Sapphiros was the big melodic hooky one, which was definitely more mid-tempo as well. This one just fucking came out swinging and really didn't stop swinging. It was just high energy as hell.
Yeah, the groove reminds me of like a Beyond Creation groove.
And then we get into the two-part closer, which the first part, Mordrake, title track, called Reverie, and this one's just more of an intro to the next part.
Mm-hmm.
Builds up this, kind of ambient melody in the beginning, goes into a big, heavy, chunky part, which I really liked, but then it abruptly stops to go back to the clean spot.
Right.
And then leads into the big track, the longest track, Mordrake 2.
I dug the fuck out of this song.
I liked it, but it wasn't like the epic closer I usually look for. It's one of my fucking things. I always look for a big epic closer on an album. It just felt like a long song rather than a big epic song. It's good, but...
Reminds me of Gojira.
Yeah, there's some Gojira squeals in there that are very, very telling. Like, one of the more dynamic moments on here I remember was a giant breakdown, which I thought was really cool, but they didn't stick with it. They instead abandoned it for the next section. And
no, they progressed with it.
It really didn't sound like a progression. They kind of moved in it, got rid of the double bass part and the big open chug.
Yeah, but it stuck with the riff, though.
Oh, the riff changed. It changed in terms of tempo, though. Not in terms of tempo, but it just changed. It didn't stick with the big chug instead of maybe building something on top of that. It just kind of changed gears. Same rhythm, same tempo, but it didn't stick with a real meaty part.
Sure.
And it kind of just stuck with that into a very long outro. Now, I like the cool vocal layering on here, and I mean, there's a lot of cool riffs on here too, but it just didn't really gel as well for me as a song. Honestly, I was looking for something that was close to Sapphiros in terms of closer, because that was, again, a monumental song on here. But all in all, this was a pretty good fucking album.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it. Honestly, in terms of Unique Leaders releases, this has definitely been one I've thoroughly enjoyed here recently.
Yeah.
This one really kind of screamed a little bit something different, and ultimately, I ended up liking it. So I'm going to give it 3.5 stars. It's a solid listen. Not without its little foibles, at least in terms of me being a picky bitch. But at the core of it, I really liked it. And there's some solid riffs in here. It's just, minor tweaks that kind of knocked it down for me. But other than that, awesome album.
I'm going to give it 4 stars. I really dug this album. I think it's experimental in terms of many facets. It reminds me of a lot of bands that I'm really into, that we've named off during the course of this review, and I like the fact, I like ambient dissonant albums, and to me personally, I can't get enough of ambient dissonance. I love it. This record is very elemental, which I like to see, especially when it's someone newer. Like, I like to see people kind of thinking outside the box still in metal, because there seems to be such a big trend of just straightforward death metal, which is great, but you don't see bands like this in this day and age pop up too much anymore. In my opinion, the gent thing is kind of falling out. Deathcore seems to be making a little bit of a comeback, but this just had a lot of elements to it, so I give it 4 stars, and that's my final answer.
So, if you like the review, give it a thumbs up. And if you are new to the channel, subscribe, because if you subscribe, you're entering a giveaway for a Cryptopsy hoodie. Once we hit 1,000 subs, we're going to use a randomizer, and one of you lucky subs are going to get a Cryptopsy hoodie. That sounds cool, right?
One of you lucky subs of bitches.
Jesus. You've never been more proud.
That was a good one.
So, for now, we'll catch you guys later, and we'll be back with more metal shit.
Enjoy.